Okay, good afternoon everybody. Are we ready to start? This feels very formal for a workshop, so hoping that you're going to be able to contribute and join in with the discussions. We're going to be talking about new approaches to promoting transparency and service user involvement in the risk assessment process. We're from Forensic Inpatient Services. We're Hertfordshire Partnership University Foundation Trust, and we comprise of two medium secure services, one in near Watford, the other up in Norfolk, and we also have a low secure service. And at the moment we're in the process of setting up a community forensic team as well, which is going to be focusing on offending behaviour. So it's not just for people who've been convicted of offences, it's also for people who are high risk of offending. So my name is Christopher Bennett and I'm the lead psychologist for Secure Services, and these are my colleagues, Dr. Susan Elliott from the Broadland Clinic and Ben Kershaw, assistant psychologist at the Eric Shepherd Services with me.
Yeah? We'll leave you to it.
Yeah, okay. So I guess what I wanted to just start with was just to get an idea from people here. How many of you are working within Secure Services where you're trying to work towards service user involvement in risk assessment? Excellent. Okay, so a few people, but not many. Are other people in Secure Services and they haven't started to look at this yet, or? No? Okay. So I think we're going to talk about the journey we've been on so far, and it is a journey, and it's certainly a process. We've gone quite a long way down that pathway, but we still have some way to go. And I hope we'll have a chance to discuss and share some ideas about how we might move things forward. So I guess really historically, thinking about the risk assessment process, particularly in Secure Services, there is something quite mystical about it. I know when I started out in Secure Services nearly 20 years ago now, it felt like something that was done to a patient. It would happen by an MDT, sometimes maybe even just one member of the MDT in a room. The person wasn't involved in it. Often the outcome of the risk assessment wasn't really shared with the person either. And it felt as if it was really, I guess, sort of like a paper exercise, really. It felt like something we had to do, but it didn't feel like it had much clinical utility. It certainly didn't feel very much as if service users fully understood the purpose of the risk assessment process, and perhaps most importantly, how it could help them move forwards through their journey. I think this sort of goes along with a lot of the sort of the restricted practices that used to happen in Secure Services as well, where really I think service users were sort of passive recipients, really, rather than being part of the process. So just thinking about how things have started to change, and I guess that the big driver was the recovery approach, and this now hopefully is the main philosophy used in most forensic services. That we are talking about a pathway, we're talking about a journey, we're trying to get people back into community services or the least restricted environments as quickly as possible, and making sure that they're part of that process. There's been several directives that have been talking about how we engage service users in this process. One of them, Best Practice in Managing Risk 2007 from the Department of Health, and then the Sainsbury Centre for Mental Health, a really helpful quote that they've given. Risk assessment and management need to become more open, more transparent with service users and staff working collaboratively together. This is particularly important in forensic and high-risk settings, where recovery is just as important a principle as it is in any other part of the mental health service. And very much this idea that people with forensic histories can be helped to move forwards and move back to community settings. I guess coming out of the recovery approach, certainly for us, was the My Shared Pathway approach, which hopefully is familiar to a lot of people here. And this is really about shared care planning, making sure service users are at the centre of their care plans, working with staff to develop those care plans. And it really is quite an important part of this collaborative approach that we're adopting. And most recently, we've got the new Code of Practice coming out of the Mental Health Act 2015, where there's a very strong emphasis on the empowerment and involvement of patients. So patients should be given the opportunity to be involved in planning, developing and reviewing their own care and treatment to help ensure that it's delivered in a way that is as appropriate and effective for them as possible. Wherever possible, care plans should be produced in consultation with the patient. So very clear directive there from the new code of practice. And then the last driver for this, and something that really got us involved in the whole collaborative risk process, was the sequin targets. Are people familiar with sequin targets? So commissioning for quality and improvement. So really a driving force in services to sort of be more innovative, to think about how we can push things forward. So really the aims of looking at a more transparent risk assessment process was really to ensure quality and fairness of the service we provide to those we treat, to make sure everybody understands why they're in a secure service, to understand the risks that are there, to understand how they might start to address those risks to move forward. To promote service user involvement in risk assessment through engagement and discussion. And I think for us this has been the real shift in making sure that any aspect of risk that we're talking about is shared with the service user. And we're going to talk about the three main ways that we've tried to achieve that. And perhaps the most important aim of all this is instilling hope amongst service users that they can achieve progress. And they can do that by understanding the relationship between their difficulties and their offending behaviour. So all the time we're talking about moving forwards, pushing people through their care and treatment pathway. So for us, the way we tried to address this was in three main ways. One of the sequin targets was to have collaborative risk workshops. So that's where we started. Workshops that both staff and service users attended to start thinking about the risk assessment and risk management process. Leading on from that, we have a safety and risk group. And that's a more in-depth opportunity for the patient to really be looking at their own risks and thinking about what they may need to be doing to move forwards. And leading on from that, risk assessment clinics. So we have adapted HCR20s, which is one of the main risk assessment tools for those of you who aren't familiar. We've adapted that to an easy read version, so our service users are much more able to engage with the process. And any risk assessment clinic we have now, we try to have a service user in that clinic working with us to review and assess the risks. I'm going to talk to you particularly, though, about the collaborative risk workshops, and then I'll hand over to Susan and Ben for the other bits. So the collaborative risk workshops, the aim of this was to get service users and staff working together, to get them thinking together about the main themes and ideas of risk assessment and risk management, and to help service users develop an understanding of how they can be involved and what that will mean for their risks. One of the key things that came out of that was that most of our service users thought that risk assessment was about stopping them doing things. They really thought it was a restrictive approach, stopping them going out, stopping them having access to things. And one of the things we noticed through this workshop is that we were able to turn that around, helping people to see that what we're trying to do is to build on their strengths and skills and to move them forward so that we actually start to break down those restrictive practices. And for us, I think it's about facilitating the positive risk-taking, making sure people have the skills that we can take those risks in a safer way. So the workshops, they happened on a monthly basis with a combination of staff and service users present, usually for about an hour and a half, and it was very much an interactive event. And these are the key areas that we wanted to focus on within the sort of workshop. So basically, we really wanted people to think, what do we mean by risk, and how can you be involved in your risks? What is the risk assessment process? So thinking a little bit about how we address risk, what are the factors we're looking at, what are the things that makes risk go up, go down, but also introducing some of the more formal tools that we might use. And I think these were the things like the HCR20, like the START, things that MDTs would be doing that service users perhaps wouldn't necessarily be aware of or know the purpose of. So it was really to give them an introduction to the tools that we use as well. We particularly wanted people to think about what can affect their risks and all the different factors that might make a risk go up or reduce the risk. So those were the key aims from the workshop. And again, we use sort of easy read, sort of pictorial formats to help people think about these things. And again, a lot of group discussion about, well, what can make your risks go up and down? There are things to do with mood, things to do with medication, things to do with exposure to things like alcohol, whether you're practicing techniques taught in some of the therapy sessions like mindfulness skills, whether you're going along to group treatments, whether you have access to the community shopping trips and things, how you're getting on with your peers in the service. So we would really help people think about all the different factors that could affect their risks. And one of the key things as well was linking it back to my shared pathway. So really helping people see that this is about a journey, it's about helping them to move forward. And I think this is really key to helping the men to really understand that we're wanting to help them move on. Some of the things that came out of the collaborative risk assessment was this idea that the men would share with us that they really didn't think the team wanted them to move on sometimes, that they felt they were stuck, and they were really able to share with us some of their thoughts about what would help them to move forwards. So we made a very clear part of the workshop, helping the men think about how they will move forward through the My Shared Pathway process. Always keeping in mind staying safe, and I think we can't get away from that, but it's how we can still promote independence, choice, activities while staying safe. So it's an ongoing process. The sequin target meant that by the end of March last year, we had to have had 95% of our registered nurses attending a workshop, and all of our patients needed to have attended a workshop, and our number of patients was 39. So we managed to achieve that target. Not all of our men wanted to be part of a group process, so we also devised some easy read sheets for one-to-one sessions, so that the psychologists or the nurses could work with the men on a one-to-one to cover the same topics that were covered in the workshop. So we met the sequin target with that. I think one of the challenges to us is trying to make something that's accessible and meaningful to both registered nurses, healthcare assistants, and the men that we're working with, and trying to have something that meets both of those needs. I think what really surprised me was the quality of the discussion that would come out of the workshops. And within the workshops, we'd have smaller group discussions with a mixture of patients and staff. And the quality of those discussions were really high, and some really good ideas were able to come forward from that. I think it's really led to an increase in transparency and ownership. I think the men really have an understanding of what risk assessment is about, how it relates to them, and how they can take ownership of it. And that the more they're involved, the more they take ownership, the more they move more quickly through their treatment pathway. And a fairly new initiative is getting the service users now to co-facilitate the workshops. And this is something that's certainly happening with Susan in the Broadland Clinic, that there's a service user there who's very much wanting to be part of that and is now delivering the training along with Susan. And that's something we're going to introduce into the other services as well. So that's the collaborative risk part of it. I don't know if there's any questions on that so far.
Would you be happy to share your HCR 20 PD and other information?
With pleasure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think Susan and Ben will come on to some of the challenges of that, but we've come up against difficulties with our electronic patient records and the format having to be in a particular way and us wanting to adapt that. But I'm sure Susan will talk through how she's managed to overcome some of that. Okay.
Not that I should be cynical, but if it wasn't a sequin, would you have done it?
I think
because you get paid for doing it.
It was one of the paid ones, absolutely.
Yeah. Would you have done it?
We had started it in the Broadland 3 months beforehand.
Certainly what we'd started was the safety and risk group as a way of getting people involved. I think the collaborative risk workshop was very much driven by the sequin, but the other aspects were starting to come out. Okay, I'll hand you over to Ben for the next one.
So, the Safety and Risk Group has been running at Warren Court for about 2 years now, and it's generally carried out about once per year to get more of the new service users through it really as an introductory group to the service. It's mostly geared towards people who will benefit most from better understanding those kind of fundamental aspects of successful treatment, which are identifying, assessing and managing their own risks. And we recently completed running the second round of it just last year. The background, there are two that it's based on really that have been implemented successfully in other secure services. One is called the Risk and Recovery Group for Offenders with Mental Disorders in South London and Maudsley, and that's very kind of HCR20 driven. It's an open-ended group where patients can attend if they wish to or not. And two main things about this group are that they get to discuss kind of vignette examples and risk profiles of the HCR20 for kind of fictional examples. And they also, if they wish to, get to discuss their own risk profiles with their peers, which often, as we often see, it's a very powerful thing to be able to get advice and things from their peer group instead of a trainer or something like that. And the other one is the Safety Planning Group in Farmfield Hospital, part of the Priory, which is more of a psychoeducational group, but it's a bit wider ranging in kind of information that they're giving to their patients. So it will cover things like the short-term assessment of risk and treatability, START, and also the structured assessment of protective factors for violence risk, which is the SAPROF. I like to think our group has kind of taken the best bits from these groups and added other elements. So it would be, ours has a skills, a coping skills focus as well. So teaching them to learn about how to manage their own risks in the future and coping with their emotions, and also it kind of gets them to see their own risk from a lot of different angles, really. A few more angles than I think the other ones do. Our criteria for entry, all of them in the service generally are mild to borderline learning disability range. Not acutely unwell is another one. We haven't experienced this if somebody becomes acutely unwell during the group, but if that were to happen, it would be a kind of individual, are they a risk to attending the group or not basis. Ability to tolerate a group setting is vital, and we have a 3 refusals and cannot complete the programme rule. It's generally not a thing that we disclose to them before unless they're running out of chances quite quickly, for the obvious reasons that if they know they've got 3 chances not to attend, they might abuse that. The measures, chose measures that we thought kind of reflected the real intentions of our group. So the first one was a semi-structured interview. In pre-assessment, they asked about knowledge of their own risks and plans for future risk management, which are kind of key indicators for us, and then kind of went back and re-asked similar, not exactly the same questions, because the nature of the post-assessment was a bit different. But we also added an evaluation and kind of participant feedback element to the post-assessment, just to get a better rounded idea of how they found the programme went. The locus of control questionnaire. Anyone who knows about locus of control, it was used to identify the change in their own beliefs that they could influence the outcomes in their own lives. So an internalised locus of control is up to you. And externalised it's all down to things like fate, and they don't have much control over their own lives. So what we were looking for there was obviously a movement from external to either internal or within the normal range by the end of it. And finally, we used a goal-based measure, which allowed them, a lot of the guys, it basically allowed them to choose a couple of goals, one throughout the course of the programme and one for their future that they'd like to be able to do a lot better, and it rated their confidence on a 10-point scale. But the thing that I found quite good about this measure was that a lot of the guys are new to the service, new to the group process, and it gives them some kind of control over what they're setting out to achieve for themselves throughout the group. I think I'm going to skip to the development quickly. So the group was developed, we used 10 sessions, I'll come on to that a bit later, but the first session is an introductory session. The second one had more of a focus on risks aren't always bad. there are such things as taking positive risks. So it's getting that idea that we're not telling them to completely look at their risk in a bad way. You can take positive risk, for example, going out on leave, gradually increasing the time or reducing the number of staff that you go on leave with the positive risk, for example. We use the hot cross bun model, this is where the CBT model really comes into it, and I found that because it's an introductory model, really giving them the foundation of thoughts, feelings, emotions and behaviours, kind of sets them up for other groups. So we run other groups like the New Me sex offender group. That has a very big component of how your thoughts can lead to behaviours. So a lot of them find that useful to generalise it to other groups, really. We also this kind of toolbox of skills idea, session 4, was really kind of identified quite randomly, but it's been used to be able to kind of, people with autism, help them with social skills training. So it might be a very visual way of kind of compartmentalising each way of acting socially. But there was a man in our recent group who did have autism, and this was something that he also specifically said that he benefited from, was having a toolbox of skills that he could use to influence his thoughts, his emotions and his body sensations in order to try and alter the behaviours that he's having, that he's showing. And if the guys didn't feel like they benefited from that kind of structured way of approaching it, at least they benefited from the 3 coping strategies that we went through with them. We use the 3 domains, so the thoughts domain would be the thought challenging process, the emotions domain would be the deep breathing exercises, and the physical sensations, kind of getting in tune with your body, was the progressive muscle relaxation. That was only a small part of the group, but it just kind of gave them an introduction to them to help. We used a vignette example, so Eric's life on session 5. This really illustrated things like helpful and unhelpful lifestyle factors that can be associated with risks in the future and risks that they might be influenced by at the moment. So that was a real theme that we found helpful to depersonalise the whole situation of noticing risks. And if we used it from, as you can see, during session 7 and 8, it was a really good thing to keep a constant theme going through the whole programme. Session 8 was a quiz if needed. It's not always necessary to have a quiz. Maybe you feel like the group are keeping up with everything quite well, so we might not. So we spent the whole session on introducing how risks are assessed in our specific unit. We kind of made a point of saying that risks are assessed often and by a lot of people, so that what we weren't trying to do, which was a kind of thought beforehand, was give them a better chance of maybe cheating the system, playing the game a bit better on how their risks are being looked at, but by giving them the messages that it's actually done, there's really no way of cheating because it's done so often. It was kind of a good way to approach, we thought. And the 7th and 8th sessions were bringing all the guys together and working with staff, with the facilitators, as a kind of mock MDT meeting. And this would be going through Eric, the vignette's life, and all the lifestyle factors he's had, which have affected his risks in the story, and then rating him his risk, really. If you know what the HCL20 is, which Susan will talk about, it's kind of all coming to an agreement on his profile by the end of it. And finally, the Staying Safe plan is just kind of a relapse prevention style. You can't really do a relapse prevention with risks, but it's really a small document designed to help them just remind themselves for future, really, what helps them personally. So we spent the last 2 sessions going through those individual plans, and there's a few printouts at the front if you want to have a look afterwards as well. Okay. So some challenges we did face were one of the biggest ones was working with offenders who are detained against their will in secure services. Feels like a bit of a kind of coercive situation, isn't it, where they don't see any need for recovery or change themselves. So how are we supposed to try and influence that and bring it out? And the prime example of this is probably at the end of the 10 weeks of the last route. One man was filling in the Staying Safe plan, and he said, "Yeah, but how do I make it look like I've got no risks?" And that kind of just went against the whole process before. But I suppose these things do happen, and that was the difficulty with this. But I suppose that brings me to the point I made earlier about are we teaching them to maybe play the game of secure services a bit better? But I felt like by modifying the HCR20 and by not giving away things like critical information in there, so the nitty-gritty of how it's all gone into, then we kind of avoided that. And also the message that risk assessment is done so often and so thoroughly that it's not really a cheatable process. Obviously there are loopholes, but most of the time. Participants generalising information from sessions to real life has proved difficult sometimes, so there is always going to be times when people slip up. But also there were a lot of good times where people said that they used the skills from the group to manage the situation better. And if an incident does happen in the unit, we did deliberate on how to approach it in the group, because we usually have a rule where what happens in the group stays in the group. Things from outside the group aren't generally discussed too much, but seeing as the topic was literally safety and risk, if someone gets into a fight or something like that happens, as it is directly related, we decided to approach it in the group. And with that, there was a risk of maybe victimising the person or making them feel victimised. But I really thought that if we were sensitive to how we questioned it and made sure that the aims of the group were to build our understanding of what safety and risk is and how they can manage their risk better, it was a lot more of a pro than a con. Just got an example of one of the guys. I won't read it all out, but essentially it's the bits in bold. So this is the first part will be the locus of control measure, where he starts off with an external locus of control at the top, and then his score gradually reduced into the normal range, indicating that he felt more responsible for his actions and able to influence events in his life. So really important for risk management. The semi-structured interview, kind of at the beginning, he couldn't think of situations. So asked about situations in the past where he might have been at risk or a risk to other people, and it also asked about their kind of future plans. So at the beginning, he couldn't really think of stuff, and it was really difficult to get him to answer anything with those questions. And at follow-up, he kind of started talking about all this risky behaviour from the past, so things like being bullied in school, he didn't feel safe there, and he also remembered being a risk to other people when he physically assaulted them. And also his index offence. His index offence was one of a sexual nature, and he identified that one as well. And his future plans were much more focused on what he wants from the future, whether he can get a job, things like what he'd like to study in a college course. So that kind of did show a lot more of a insight into what he needs to do and what he feels he can do. And the goals-based measure they both increased from 1.5 to 5, which moved from not being met to the goal reaching halfway, which was good enough for the goals with the group and in the future. So the last part of the safety and risk group is just some feedback from the participants, really, and hopefully it's just reflecting the diverse experiences that they got from it and what they learned, and also a lot of the positive things about it, and we thought there were a lot more positive things than negative things.
So part of the third phase of our collaborative risk assessment process, really after the group, was setting up some of these risk clinics. I'll do my best to summarise them, but they look very different depending on who the service user is, because we've tried to make sure that they're really led by the service user and that they've got choice over how it works. Currently we're only doing the HCR20 in the risk clinic, but we're hoping to move toward doing the START assessment as well in time, but it's a bit of a process at the moment. So we run the risk clinics every 6 months, which runs in line with the review period for the HCR20. Obviously, if somebody needed one quicker than that for whatever reason, then we would facilitate that. Initially, we were thinking, we're introducing a meeting and we've already got lots of meetings. How are we going to go about getting this prioritised? So we brought it in line with the CPA process, and we sent out invites, which was very similar to what happens to the CPAs, and tried to make it a bit more formal. But what we found was when the staff knew that the patients had invited them to the meeting, they actually prioritised it anyway, so we didn't need to probably do it as formally as that. We had a number of focus groups with the service users themselves to get some guidance really on what they thought was going to be helpful, and they really helped us plan these, talked about what would be helpful, what wasn't so helpful, and what came out was each person wanted something different. So we've tried to make it as person-centred as possible, but doable within the clinic. These have tended to be smaller meetings, so each person will choose who attends. Typically, our risk clinics have only really had 3 to 4 other professionals in there, and the service user and the staff have said that that feels quite different from the CPA meetings and the MDTs, that there feels like there's more thinking space because there's less things to go through, and it just feels a bit more calm for some people, especially for the service users who have difficulty talking maybe in groups or in feeling like the MDT meetings are stressful and what have you. So most people have chosen a smaller size group, which we have found interesting. But the core thing from the risk clinics really is the patient choice. So they could have a family member in there if they wanted. We would invite the family member in for that. Also, the service user chooses the structure of the meeting, so how they would like to run it. And we invited the service users to help us design a HCR20 scoring form. And we've ended up with 3 or 4 forms actually, which people can choose from, which I'll come on to in a little while. Unfortunately, I have to apologise. I've tried to screenshot these in and it hasn't worked very well, but I have got some hard copies for you ladies who wanted some, so come and get them at the end. But this is one example of one of the shared HCR20s that we designed in one of the focus groups, and it's actually the most popular one. So it combines the traffic light system, and we also looked at the language of, I don't know if everybody has seen the HCR20 or not, but this first item is usually called historical, and it's about someone's historical risk. So instead of using the word historical, we've just said risky things that we've done in the past. So we've just went down the items and tried to explain them and use a little bit more accessible language. We've done that with the speech and language therapist and with the service users. Some of our service users only use the traffic light system, others use that, write in a lot of information into the boxes. And this has been a helpful process if the MDT disagree with the rating that the service user is giving themselves, and we can have that discussion and figure out why. It's opened up a lot of discussions about that. This item was clinical, so they've changed it to the things I can change, and this is the section that most of the service users like to move on to because they feel that they're able to do something then about their risk. And they said that they feel that they're able to make plans in this section, which is really helpful. Things like insight, we've changed to my understanding of my problems or risk, and it goes on. So we've got the examples if anyone would like to look. Some people didn't want to use the traffic light, so they opted for a different version. And so other people wanted to use the electronic version for whatever reason, which is a drop-down box thing. So it really is about the person's choice. So we've been running the risk clinics now for about 9 months, and I think of the group of 25 people, we've had 17 who are now using the risk clinics. And we've had a little bit of feedback. So far, one of the nurses pointed out that they felt they used to have to do the HCR20s by themselves when they were on nights, and therefore felt the responsibility fell on their shoulders a little bit. So they felt the risk clinic sort of opened up the discussions and it was more shared, importantly with the service user as well. We've had some feedback from service users, and in general they do say they found it helpful because they didn't know what was written about them, and that has been a real theme. They knew that there were risk assessments and people were writing things about them, but they didn't know what was actually written in them. So they have found it helpful. Some of our service users have found it quite upsetting at times, because initially hearing some of the things and seeing it in black and white can be quite tricky. So it really is a process, and depending on the service user, it might be that we split the risk assessment into sections and do it more individually initially. We would really work it around the needs of that person in front of us. So setting goals has been particularly helpful as well, because a lot of people have said we didn't understand why the MDT were making these suggestions for us, and so then we're able to open up those discussions as well and have those decisions on the table. And people have started to talk a little bit more about those goals and risk-related goals in their CPA and MDT meetings now, because I think they're becoming more used to having the discussions, whereas before they didn't feel that they wanted to bring it. So that's helpful. Some people haven't wanted to do a risk clinic, and again, that's their choice. And then they're aware that the MDT would do that. Without them there, we would still have a risk clinic. And just to, I think it was one of your points, we found that actually individualising the sheets was really quite tricky in terms of auditing and monitoring, and for targets and things. So we've got a target where we have to complete a risk assessment for every patient within the first 3 months. So we were just trying to work out how do we go about that, and sometimes the first risk assessment that a service user will complete won't look complete to us because maybe they haven't done the formulation section quite yet, or they haven't moved on to the scenario section quite yet. So we've had to work around all of that. We've come up with all of those tools now, and we've worked out a system where we can just save them electronically onto the Paris system, which is the clinical records, and that seems to be working okay, but it's something that we just have to work with, and it has been a little bit tricky. So getting people together initially was a little bit tricky, but actually people ended up prioritising the meetings, especially when the risk discussions were being encouraged, and especially when the patients were inviting the staff to come. And finally, it's really, we have found that it's more of a process, so it's difficult to say something's complete because it feels like it's a real process for the patient or the service user. So maybe when they're first admitted, they'll be working a little bit more and working out what their risks are. But hopefully as they progress through the therapies and treatments, they'll be working a little bit more toward their safety plans, as you mentioned, Ben, and formulating their risks and working out what might reduce their risk. So it's a real process from start to finish, and that's something that we as professionals have to manage in terms of showing that we're meeting the target and completing the HCR20, etc. And I think that's all about the risk clinics. I had brought quite a few of the materials because I wasn't sure how to balance this as a workshop or how interactive it would be. So I can just leave these at the front if people are interested. These are various examples of the documents that the patients helped design, some feedback sheets, and the patients and myself wrote an article about the group, which you can also have, especially if somebody's setting them up. It might be helpful for you. I don't know if anyone has any questions then for us, or... Yeah, I don't see any reason why not. We do work closely with some of the community learning disability psychologists, and they have talked about starting a group, not specifically for this, but to include risk issues as well as coping strategies and other things. So there would be no reason why you couldn't adapt it for a community setting and share that risk assessment in that way. I think it would be helpful, because I think one of the things that you highlighted, Chris, was that these used to be done without the service user, and actually the important thing is to involve them so they know exactly what's in there to help them, give them ownership over their risk actually, and how to reduce it.
Thank you very much.